There are places in Nevada where even the wind seems to vanish, swallowed by the endless hush of the desert. Ranger Elena Cruz had learned to trust that silence, learned to read it, let it settle into her bones during the long patrols that wound between red cliffs and wild sage. But on this blistering July afternoon, the silence was wrong, too absolute, too thick, almost waiting for something to snap. Her horse, Maya, felt it too. The chestnut mare's ears flicked back and forth, nostrils flaring at scents Elena couldn't name. She stroked Maya's neck, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. It was supposed to be a routine check, a sweep of Bighorn Canyon, just outside the reservation boundary, where rumors had started to swirl about illegal fencing and strangers marking off land that wasn't theirs. Elena's radio buzzed uselessly at her hip, all static. She was used to dead zones, but today it grated on her. She pressed on, boots creaking in the leather stirrups, hand resting lightly on the grip of her old revolver, just in case. It happened so fast even the desert didn't have time to echo her shout. 1 second, Maya was picking her way around a sun-bleached boulder. The next, the world exploded. Someone shouted, a flash of movement, a glint of metal, and Maya reared, screaming. Elena hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her. She rolled, dirt in her mouth, trying to see through the spinning dust and glare. Heavy boots thundered toward her. She scrambled up, arms flailing, but strong hands caught her, wrenched her wrists behind her back. A canvas sack came down over her head, rough, suffocating. She kicked and fought, but another man pinned her legs, their voices curt, angry, urgent. She saw the post. Just grab her gear and tie her up. Move, move. Rough rope cut into her wrists, then her ankles. Someone yanked the radio from her belt, smashed it against a rock. Elena heard Maya's frantic whinnies fade into the distance, hooves pounding as the mare fled. The men didn't bother to chase her. They had what they wanted. You shouldn't have come back here, a voice growled close to her ear. There was a chill in that anger, not hot, but businesslike, rehearsed. Next time, keep your nose out. No one's coming to save you. They dragged her, blind, choking on her own panic, across the ground. Sagebrush tore at her sleeves, sand scraped her cheek raw. She tried to shout, but a rag was shoved into her mouth, nearly gagging her. It felt like miles before they stopped. Someone tied her, upright, to the trunk of a twisted juniper. They checked the knots, then she heard the men walk away, their footsteps swallowed by the crunch of gravel, and then nothing. Only the sizzle of the sun and her own shallow, frantic breaths. Elena forced herself to listen, really listen. In the emptiness, every sound was a clue. The creak of her bindings, the faint click of beetles, a far-off vulture's cry. No engine, no voices. She jerked her shoulders, testing the knots, but these men knew their knots. Cowboy knots, practiced, cruel. Blood trickled down her wrist. Minutes slid by, then hours. The sun arced higher, burning through the sack over her head. Sweat pooled under her arms, ran down her back, stinging the scrapes. Her tongue swelled, lips cracked, head pounding with thirst. No shadow crept to offer her mercy. The heat was relentless, a living thing crawling over her skin, whispering weakness in her ear. She shifted, trying to ease the pain. The movement sent agony through her arms, but she gritted her teeth. Think, stay alert. Someone would notice she was gone, eventually. Her patrol log said she was in this sector. Unless the men wiped the sign, unless no one checked the schedule, unless... Time twisted, slowed. Sometimes she saw spots swimming under her eyelids, colors melting, memories tangled with the pain, the way her mother used to hum while boiling coffee, her first day on horseback, the laughter of her brother at family dinners, the fire at her last station. She clung to them, each memory a little anchor, holding her mind above the panic. A coyote yipped somewhere out in the empty, its voice rising and falling. The desert was alive, but it wouldn't save her. She thought of Maya. Had her horse run for safety, or would the men try to catch her? The thought of the gentle animal caught by those hands made Elena shudder. She tried yelling, once, twice. The gag muffled everything, scraping her throat raw. No answer came. No sign of rescue, no whine of an engine, no crunch of tires on gravel. Afternoon bled into dusk, and the shadows lengthened. The temperature dropped quickly, sharp and sudden, a cruel contrast to the heat. Elena shivered uncontrollably, body shocked by the change. She drifted in and out of awareness. She dreamed she was floating above the desert, watching herself tied to the tree like a rag doll. Something scuttled near her boot, a scorpion, or maybe just a beetle she couldn't see. Fear crawled up her spine, but she was too weak to do more than shiver. As night fell, her head drooped, muscles spasming from exhaustion and thirst. Above her, the stars blinked on, one by one, unfeeling witnesses. The desert silence pressed in, thicker than ever, as if holding its breath. Alone, Elena Cruz waited, barely clinging to consciousness, surrounded by the wild, and watched by eyes she could not yet see. The first thing Elena noticed was the cold. Sometime in the dead of night, the wind shifted, carrying a new chill down from the high ridges. The pain in her arms had dulled into something distant, replaced by numbness and an odd, weightless fatigue. She struggled to keep her eyes open, brain flickering in and out of feverish dreams. One moment she was back in her childhood home, the next she was floating above the desert, disembodied and adrift. Then, hoofbeats. At first she thought it was another hallucination. A memory of Maya, maybe, or just her brain trying to make sense of the wild cacophony inside her skull. But the sound grew louder, clearer, rhythmic, steady, impossibly real. It echoed between the rocky outcroppings, grew nearer, not in a rush, but with a measured confidence. Elena's heart lurched. She forced herself to listen. There was no engine, no human voices, just the unmistakable drumming of hooves on hard-packed earth. For a moment, she almost hoped it was a rescue team on horseback. But then the hoofbeats split, fanned out, a group, not a pair or a single mount. The ground seemed to vibrate with their presence. Suddenly, the air shifted. The sack over her head was torn, but a sliver of light had started to pierce through the edges. She blinked, eyes watering in the darkness. Was she dreaming, or was there something moving in the shadows? Something tall, powerful, gliding through the blue-black night. Then they appeared. A herd of mustangs, wild, free, unbranded, emerged from the darkness. Their shapes were ghostly at first, blending with the moon-washed rocks and sage, but as her eyes adjusted, Elena could count them, 6, maybe 7. They fanned out in a loose circle around her, nostrils flaring, manes rippling in the slight wind. And at the center of them all was a stallion unlike any horse Elena had ever seen. He stood a full hand taller than the rest, his coat a gleaming black that seemed to swallow the moonlight. A silver scar traced a line down from his right eye. An old wound, healed but unforgettable. He stared at her, unblinking, his presence commanding the entire herd. Midnight. Elena's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. She'd heard stories, rumors whispered among the rangers about a black Mustang with a scar and a temperament nobody could break. Old cowboys swore he'd evaded every roundup, every trap, for years. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he was the spirit of the desert itself. Now, here he was, close enough that she could see the muscles ripple under his dark hide. The herd didn't panic. They didn't bolt. Instead, they seemed to settle into a deliberate formation, placing themselves between Elena and the wide, empty desert. 2 young mares lingered on either side of her, occasionally lowering their heads to sniff the earth. One, a dun-colored beauty with a blaze down her nose, lay down near her feet, tucking her legs under her body and blocking the wind from Elena's exposed side. The movement seemed gentle, almost intentional, as if the mare understood Elena's suffering and had chosen to offer what comfort she could. Midnight circled once, keeping his good eye locked on Elena. Then he stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see his breath plume in the cold air. He watched her with an intelligence that sent a shiver through her, as if he were weighing her soul. Minutes slipped by, stretching into hours. Elena's mind drifted, pulled back by the sound of the horses shifting, snorting quietly, sometimes stamping a hoof or flicking a tail. The circle never broke. If anything, the herd seemed to tighten their guard as coyotes called in the distance and the wind whistled through the rocks. Elena felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness, but the steady presence of the horses anchored her to reality. She wondered what had drawn them here. The desert was wide, wild, unkind. Wild horses had no reason to approach humans, especially ones tied up and helpless. Yet not only had they come, they had chosen to stay. Protectors. Sentinels. Ghosts of a wilder age. As the hours passed, Elena's mind wandered in and out of awareness. At one point, she heard the heavy footfalls of something approaching, a lone coyote, emboldened by hunger. The animal slunk close, eyes glinting in the moonlight. Midnight lowered his head and stamped, a low, warning rumble rising from his chest. The coyote froze, reconsidered, then melted back into the shadows. With each passing moment, Elena's gratitude for the horses deepened. Their presence wasn't just a comfort, it was a shield. They gave her warmth, security, a strange sense of companionship even in her darkest hour. It was as if they understood, on some primal level, that she needed them. Or maybe, she thought hazily, they simply recognized another creature fighting to survive in the desert's harsh embrace. Sometime before dawn, the wind picked up. The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting her cheeks and make her shiver uncontrollably. The dun mare pressed closer, body heat radiating through the rough fabric of Elena's jacket. For a fleeting moment, Elena imagined herself as one of them, wild, untamed, running free under the desert moon. As night finally began to give way to the faintest blush of morning, Elena realized that Midnight had not moved. The stallion remained at his post, ever watchful, his mane rippling in the wind. The others relaxed slightly, grazing or dozing where they stood, but he did not let his guard down. It was as if he had taken it upon himself to keep her safe until the world was ready to wake. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, not from pain, not from fear, but from a fierce gratitude she could barely name. The herd owed her nothing. She was an outsider, a creature of the world that hunted, corralled, and claimed the land as its own. Yet here, in the vast loneliness of the desert, she was not abandoned. She was, somehow, chosen. The first rays of sun crept over the ridges, lighting the wild horses in a halo of gold. Midnight tossed his head, snorted, and pawed at the ground, sending a shower of dust into the air. The herd stirred, as if waking from a collective dream. Elena closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the new day soak into her battered body. She whispered a silent promise to herself. If she survived, she would never forget this night. She would remember the courage of wild things, the mercy of strangers who asked for nothing in return. As the desert woke, Elena Cruz, tired, broken, but not alone, realized that, in the kingdom of the wild, sometimes the greatest strength was simply to endure, and sometimes survival meant surrendering to the silent, steadfast watch of those who have nothing to lose but their freedom. The light of morning in the Nevada desert has a way of slicing through everything: pain, memory, even the lingering fog of a near-death night. Elena blinked against it as dawn broke, feeling every nerve in her body scream for water. Her lips were cracked and swollen, her throat burned as if she had swallowed hot coals. Even with her eyes barely open, she could see the herd in sharper relief now. The Mustangs weren't ghosts after all. They were real, solid, powerful, and for reasons she still couldn't explain, they were still there. The dun mare stood up and shook off the chill, then turned to nudge Elena's boot. The gesture was surprisingly gentle. Elena tried to move her hands, but the rope still bit into her wrists, slick now with sweat and a thin trickle of blood. She managed a muffled sound, half plea, half gasp. The black stallion, Midnight, took a step closer. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if measuring her will to survive. It was then Elena heard another sound, scraping, rhythmic, insistent. She turned her head and saw two of the younger Mustangs pawing at the earth, hooves striking dust and stone. The ground here was bone dry, but the horses worked tirelessly, snorting with effort, until finally a faint shimmer of moisture appeared in the soil. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. A buried spring. There, of all places. Elena's training kicked in. Her survival instincts, honed by years on the job, screamed at her to move, to drink, to do anything to save herself. She wriggled, desperate. Her hands were numb, but she twisted her arms as best as she could. She braced her legs against the tree, and with a guttural cry, managed to rock her body sideways. The rope slid lower. She inched forward, knees scraping the ground. The horses stepped aside just enough to let her through, forming a narrow passage. Elena's vision swam. She forced herself on, crawling toward the muddy patch where water now seeped up, dark and cool. It wasn't much, just a thin, muddy trickle. But it was enough. She pressed her lips to the earth, sucking in mouthfuls of water and mud, coughing, drinking, sobbing in relief. None of the mustangs interfered. Midnight watched, head lowered, as if granting her permission. Elena drank until she could finally think again, until her strength began to trickle back. The spring's water was gritty but sweet, a lifeline in a place that seldom showed mercy. Once her thirst had eased, Elena sat back, dazed, staring at the herd. The horses in turn seemed almost bored, grazing on sparse tufts of grass, tails flicking at flies. But Midnight didn't relax. He stayed near her, always between Elena and the open expanse of the desert, as if to shield her from any threat. For a long moment, Elena simply breathed. The pain, the exhaustion, even the fear, none of it could touch her gratitude. She remembered stories her grandmother used to tell about wild horses that protected the innocent, about old spirits that roamed the land and watched over those in need. Elena had always thought of them as legends, as comfort for lonely nights. Now, staring into Midnight's steady gaze, she wondered if there was truth to any of it. Her head cleared, Elena surveyed her situation. Her wrists were raw, but she could move them a bit more now. She tested the knots, searching for a weakness. With the moisture from the spring still on her skin, she managed to work her hands free, bit by bit. It was slow, grueling work. Her arms trembled, her shoulders ached. But the rope, slick with sweat and blood, finally loosened. With a desperate tug, she pulled her wrists out, gasping with pain and relief. She yanked the rag from her mouth, coughed, and spat dust onto the ground. She took another shaky sip from the spring, then checked her surroundings. The mustangs watched her, but made no move to run. It was as if they were waiting for something, as if her struggle to survive was a test that she had passed. Then, without warning, Midnight lifted his head and let out a shrill, commanding whinny. The sound echoed across the rocks, making the other horses perk up. Elena watched, curious, as Midnight turned and trotted toward the edge of the clearing. He paused only once to look back at her as if urging her to watch. Two other stallions, younger and lighter in color, followed him. Together, the three disappeared into a stand of twisted pines on the horizon. Elena struggled to her feet, swaying with dizziness. Her first instinct was panic. Were they abandoning her? But something in Midnight's manner reassured her. He wasn't fleeing. He was on a mission. Elena felt it in her bones. She turned her attention to the remaining horses, who showed no signs of alarm. The dun mare even came close enough for Elena to touch her velvety nose, breathing in her scent, a mix of sage, earth, and wildness. Elena smiled through cracked lips, marveling at the improbable comfort of this moment. As the sun rose higher, Elena realized she couldn't stay here forever. The men who'd left her in the desert could return. She had to move, to find help, or at the very least, to put distance between herself and this place of ambush. She limped toward a rocky outcrop, hoping to get her bearings, but her legs were unsteady and weak. Each step was a struggle. That was when she heard a distant sound. A shout? An engine? No, it was nothing. Just the desert playing tricks again. She sat down, head in her hands, and tried to focus. She was alive. She had water. She had her freedom. Barely. But her mind kept returning to Midnight and the stallions who had vanished into the trees. Where had they gone? Why had they left just then? The answer nagged at her, a mystery more powerful than fear. She found herself hoping, foolishly perhaps, that the horses had some plan, some way of helping her that went beyond what any wild animal should be capable of. By noon, the sun was merciless again, but Elena no longer felt quite as helpless. The mustangs drifted away as the heat climbed, the dun mare pausing only once to look back, as if to say goodbye. Elena waved weakly, feeling a bittersweet ache in her heart. In this lonely, dangerous place, she'd been shown mercy by the wild. She didn't know what would happen next. But as she gathered her strength and prepared to move, Elena understood something vital. She was not alone. In the heart of the desert, where survival was always uncertain, the wild had chosen to share its secrets and its strength with her. She picked herself up, grit in her teeth and hope in her heart, and started walking toward whatever fate awaited her beyond the rocks and the rising sun. By the time the shadows stretched long over the Nevada desert, Elena Cruz's body felt wrung out, every step a challenge. The wild horses had faded into the landscape, leaving her with only the memory of their quiet protection, the lingering scent of sagebrush, and the hope that midnight's departure meant something more than abandonment. She moved slowly, her joints stiff and raw from hours of restraint, skin blistered under the punishing sun. The world tilted around her with every step, but she pressed forward, toward survival, toward a miracle, or perhaps just toward whatever came next. Miles away, at the edge of the Bighorn Canyon Range, a different kind of morning unfolded at the remote ranger station. James Park, barely 24 and still earning the trust of his older colleagues, started his shift with black coffee and the droning, familiar sound of the radio. The static was normal. The boredom, too. What wasn't normal, what made James's heart stutter, was the sight of 3 wild horses circling just outside the chain-link fence near the station's front gate. He'd seen horses before, plenty, but never this close to the outpost, never lingering in broad daylight, and certainly never so organized. They moved with intent, pacing in a slow, tight arc, first one way, then another, tails swishing, eyes sharp and restless. At the front stood a black stallion, regal and scarred, impossible to mistake for any ordinary Mustang. Midnight. James recognized him instantly from the grainy, sun-faded photo pinned to the break room bulletin board. Local legend untouchable. If seen, do not approach. James pressed his face to the dusty glass and stared. The horses didn't bolt, didn't shy from the sound of doors opening. If anything, they watched him right back, especially the stallion, who stood absolutely still, fixing James with an intelligent, searching gaze. The rookie ranger hesitated, then unlatched the gate and stepped outside, heart pounding. He held his hands up, voice low and steady. "Easy there. You boys lost?" His words fell away in the morning air, swallowed by the distance between man and beast. But the horses did not flinch. Instead, Midnight stamped once, sharply, drawing James's attention, then tossed his head toward the horizon, where the desert met the sky. James thought of the stories, about horses warning miners of flash floods, about the uncanny sense wild creatures had for danger and need. He glanced back at the station, then at the horses, then made a decision. There was something urgent in their presence, something he couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. He grabbed his radio and keys, then climbed into the battered Jeep, watching as the black stallion turned and began to trot away, not toward the open wilds, but along the gravel road that snaked toward the canyons. The 2 other Mustangs followed, flanking him, glancing back every so often to make sure James was keeping up. It was as if they were escorting him, leading him to something or someone waiting beyond the ridges. The journey was surreal. The Mustangs moved with purpose, never veering from the road, never allowing James to lose sight of them. He radioed in, trying to explain, but only got static in reply. He considered turning back, but something deeper than logic compelled him forward. The stallion's confidence, the coordinated movements, the way they'd sought him out, all of it felt like a message written in a language older than words. Meanwhile, Elena pushed herself onward, mind clouded with fatigue and hope. She had lost track of time, her internal clocks scrambled by the ordeal. When she heard the distant rumble of an engine, she almost dismissed it as a hallucination. But the sound grew louder, too real, too steady to be a trick of the mind. She dragged herself up a rocky incline, peering out through the heat shimmer. That was when she saw them. 3 wild horses galloping at the head of a battered Jeep, dust swirling around them, sunlight gleaming off Midnight's black coat. Elena almost cried out, half believing it was some new fever dream. But then the Jeep screeched to a halt and a figure leapt out. James scrambled up the slope, radio crackling uselessly at his hip, heart racing. Hello? Ranger Cruz? Elena? Oh my God. He found her slumped against the rocks, face sunburned, lips split, eyes red-rimmed and wild with exhaustion. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, the reality too strange to process. She managed a hoarse laugh. "You followed the horses?" James blinked, glancing back at the stallion who stood just out of reach, flanked by his companions. Yeah, they came for me. Wouldn't let me say no." Elena tried to rise, legs wobbling, but James was already at her side, steadying her with a strong arm. He checked her pulse, offered her a canteen. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, feeling every cell in her body sing with relief. "I thought," she began, but the words caught. There was too much to say. About the men who had left her, about the wild horses who had saved her, about the uncanny sense of connection that still lingered. James, meanwhile, tried to process what he was seeing. He looked at the horses, now watching quietly from a distance, their mission apparently complete. And then at Elena. "How long were you out here?" "Long enough," she managed, voice rough. "If not for them, I'd be gone." He helped her into the Jeep, eyes darting back to Midnight, who met his gaze and held it. James felt something pass between them, not understanding exactly, but respect. He didn't try to approach, didn't try to touch. He just nodded, once, in silent thanks. Elena turned in her seat, searching the wild for one last glimpse. Midnight stood on a rise, mane whipping in the wind, eyes shining with a knowing light. For a moment, time seemed to pause, woman, horse, and desert bound together, by an experience that would never quite fit inside the limits of language. James started the engine. The horses watched until the Jeep was just a smudge on the horizon, then turned and melted back into the wild. Inside the Jeep, Elena stared out the window, gratitude and awe, fighting for space inside her chest. She had been rescued by the very creatures she had spent her career protecting, their silent vigilance far more powerful than anything she could have planned or predicted. As they bumped down the dirt road toward headquarters, Elena knew her ordeal was far from over. The world would want answers, explanations, something to make sense of what had happened. But deep in her soul, she understood. The wild had spoken, not with words, but with action. And she had survived because she'd learned, at last, to listen. And out in the endless sweep of the desert, a black stallion watched the sun rise, unbroken and unbowed, carrying secrets only the wild could truly understand. Back at the ranger headquarters, Elena Cruz sat wrapped in a blanket, still tasting the dust of the desert on her tongue, the memory of sun and pain clinging to her like a second skin. Her hands shook as she sipped from a steaming cup of coffee, every muscle in her body humming with exhaustion and disbelief. Beside her, James Park kept one eye on her and another on the hallway outside, knowing questions, in chaos, were only moments away. He was right. Word spread fast in small towns and government corridors alike, and Elena's rescue was far too strange to be ignored. Within hours, the station buzzed with voices, rangers, local deputies, the county sheriff, even a local TV crew clamoring for interviews. Rumors bloomed and multiplied. Ranger found alive after 3 days missing. Survived by luck? No. Saved by wild horses. Was it real? A hallucination? A miracle? Or a desperate myth to cover up a near tragedy? Elena, drained and overwhelmed, said little. She let the doctors examine her, let the nurses bandage her wrists and check her for dehydration. When the sheriff asked what happened, she gave only the barest outline. Her ambush, the men who left her to die, the wild herd that circled and watched over her until help arrived. Some of the rangers, tough men and women who'd spent a lifetime in these wild places, listened in silence, trading looks that blended wonder with skepticism. Others just shook their heads, muttering about heat stroke and the tricks of the desert. But the facts, stubborn as rocks, refused to be dismissed. Elena's broken radio was found near the spot where she'd been ambushed, the tire marks and tracks matching her report. Most remarkably, dozens of wild horse hoofprints surrounded the site, clear, undeniable, pressed into the sandy soil in a broad, protective ring. Even the GPS on the Jeep told its own story, James's drive matched the path of the Mustangs, winding through places he'd never patrolled before, arriving at the outcrop just as Elena had described. By midday, the story had outgrown the headquarters. Local news vans clustered at the gates, satellite dishes bristling. A field reporter, eyes bright with excitement, cornered Elena outside the medical bay. "Is it true, Ranger Cruz? Did wild horses really save your life?" The camera hovered, waiting for something sensational. Elena hesitated, squinting into the harsh sunlight. She glanced at James, who gave her a supportive nod. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "All I can say is I wouldn't be here without them. They found me. They stayed when anyone else would have run." She paused, searching for words that might fit the experience. Sometimes, nature is more generous than we deserve. The clip aired that night, and by morning, the world had seized on the story. Headlines flared across websites and social media. "Mustangs save Ranger in Nevada desert. Miracle in Bighorn Canyon. Did wild horses outsmart criminals?" News anchors argued over the details, some dismissing the tale as fanciful, others calling it proof of something mysterious and wonderful in the world. Behaviorists, biologists, and horse trainers were drawn into the fray. One wildlife expert on TV scoffed, "Mustangs are wild, not Lassie. They don't save people." But another, a seasoned Mustang specialist, shook her head and smiled. "Sometimes the wild surprises us. Horses are curious, empathetic creatures. There are stories, rare but real, of animals stepping in when a human's in need. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to explain it away." Even the governor tweeted about Elena's story, praising her courage and calling for greater protections for Nevada's wild herds. Donations to local horse sanctuaries spiked. Kids drew pictures of Midnight, his black coat and silver scar, standing like a hero beside a fallen ranger. A popular podcast invited listeners to share their own stories of being helped by animals, sparking a wave of heartfelt, often unbelievable tales. Not everyone believed, of course. Some skeptics accused Elena of making it up, desperate for attention or to stall the controversial land deals she'd been investigating. "It's a myth," a land developer grumbled on the local radio, his voice thick with annoyance. "A distraction from real issues. Horses can't save people, only people can do that." Elena kept mostly silent, avoiding the spotlight, letting the story spiral beyond her reach. Inside, she struggled with her own questions. Had the Mustangs really chosen her? Had Midnight known she needed help? Or was it all some strange alignment of instinct and chance? She replayed every detail in her mind, the way the herd had circled her, the way the dun mare had sheltered her from the wind, the strange intelligence in Midnight's eyes. One night, weeks after her rescue, she sat alone in her small apartment, staring at a notebook full of half-finished thoughts. She knew what the world wanted, an answer, a neat explanation. But all she had was a feeling, a certainty that the wild, in its own way, had recognized her vulnerability and decided to intervene. She found herself avoiding interviews, refusing to cash in on the fame. "Not yet," she told James, who checked in on her often, bringing groceries and quiet conversation. "It's not about me. The real story isn't what the horses did for me. It's what they still do, every day, out there in the wild." "It's about respect." James nodded. "People want a hero, but sometimes the hero's not human." Elena smiled. "Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe we need to believe in something bigger than ourselves." In the following weeks, camera crews and journalists faded away, searching for the next headline. But among ranchers, rangers, and the people who lived closest to the land, Elena's story lived on. The Mustangs of Bighorn Canyon became local legends, their hoofprints the subject of whispered stories around campfires. Midnight, especially, became a symbol. Untamed, elusive, respected. One evening, Elena returned quietly to the place where she'd nearly died. She stood for a long time in the waning light, watching the hills, listening for hoofbeats. At the edge of the clearing, the wind picked up, and for a moment she thought she saw a black shape against the horizon, watchful, wild, free. She closed her eyes, breathed in the clean desert air, and whispered a silent thank you. She knew, deep down, that the world would never fully understand what had happened to her out there. maybe that was for the best. Some truths belong to the wild, to the horses, and to the silent spaces between words, places where faith, gratitude, and awe lived on, waiting for the next soul willing to listen. Late summer turned the Nevada hills to gold, the wind carrying with it the scents of sage, dust, and distant thunder. Elena Cruz, finally healed enough to hike, set out alone one morning with a small pack, a thermos of water, and a notebook she'd barely dared to write in since her rescue. There had been too many interviews, too much noise. Everyone wanted a quote, a secret, a miracle neatly packaged. But out here, in the wild, she could let all that fade. Out here, it was just the living land and the rhythm of her own breath. The trail she chose led deep into Bighorn Canyon's backcountry, winding between ancient junipers and red rock spires. She walked for hours, letting the steady ache in her legs push aside thoughts of deadlines and headlines. Now and then, she paused to check for hoofprints, evidence of the mustangs she'd come to know in her ordeal. Mostly, though, she listened. To the wind, to the faint trickle of a spring, to the rustle of lizards darting through brittle brush. As the sun rose higher, Elena came upon the edge of a wide, grassy meadow, dappled with shadow. She stopped, breathing hard. On the far side, barely visible at first, a scattered herd grazed quietly. Wild mustangs. Some lifted their heads, wary but not panicked. Their coats glistened. Dun, roan, chestnut, and there, unmistakable even at a distance, was Midnight. He stood apart, high on a ridge above the others, his black mane blowing, silver scar catching the light. He watched her, no, not her, exactly, but the space she occupied. Elena sensed the distinction immediately. She was not the center of this story, just a visitor at the border of a kingdom that belonged to the wild. Elena knew she couldn't simply walk up and expect acceptance. Instead, she found a boulder in the grass, sat quietly, and waited. She didn't call out, didn't try to whistle or coax the horses near. She just existed, shoulders soft, heart open, a willing presence in their world. The hours stretched. Grasshoppers chirred in the heat. The mustangs grazed, always glancing her way, sometimes shifting their formation so that foals and mares stayed behind a wall of sturdy bodies. Elena wrote a few notes, mostly sketches and fragments, her hands unsure, her mind uncluttered for the first time in weeks. Day faded to evening. The sun painted long shadows across the meadow, and the herd gradually moved closer, inch by inch. Midnight was last to approach. He moved with slow confidence, pausing at a respectful distance, his gaze never wavering. Elena didn't dare to meet it directly for long. There was a power in his wildness that demanded humility. Without warning, a commotion rippled through the group. A foal, gangly and bright-eyed, stumbled near a patch of loose shale. Elena's ranger instincts flared. She saw at once that the foal was limping, favoring its left hind leg. She recognized the signs. A bad strain, maybe a fracture. The mare, frantic, nuzzled the foal, nickering softly. The rest of the herd pressed closer, nervous energy crackling in the dusk. Elena's hand found the tranquilizer kit she'd packed. A last minute, just in case, precaution. She watched as the foal struggled, the mare circling, Midnight hovering nearby, tail lashing. Elena knew from experience how easily wild horses could panic, especially when a human moved too fast or too close. She readied the tranquilizer, but hesitated. Was it the right thing, or just the familiar human urge to intervene, to fix, to control? Then, Midnight did something she'd never seen in a wild stallion. He left the safety of the herd and approached Elena with measured steps. He didn't threaten, didn't bolt, didn't even pin his ears. Instead, he walked close. So close Elena could see the fine scars on his face, the flecks of dust on his flank. He stopped a yard away, lowered his head, and touched her hand with his nose. Softly, a single, deliberate gesture. Then he stepped back, signaling her to wait. Elena's heart thudded. She lowered her tranquilizer, understanding the message. Trust the wild. Wait. The foal, exhausted, lay down in the grass, sides heaving. The mare stepped aside, watching with wide, liquid eyes. Elena stayed still, only her eyes moving. She watched as midnight returned to the herd, nuzzling the foal, standing guard over the small, shivering shape. Dusk deepened. Coyotes yipped in the far hills, but the Mustang stayed firm, forming a wall of muscle and intent around the injured foal. For nearly an hour, Elena waited. Her muscles cramped, but she didn't move. She breathed with the land, letting the wild's own rhythm guide her. The foal, finally, eased up from the grass, trembling but upright. It limped to its mother, who welcomed it with a nuzzle. Midnight glanced at Elena, then at the foal. Another silent message passed between them. At last, Elena approached. She moved slowly, careful not to make herself a threat. The mare allowed her close. With gentle hands, Elena examined the foal's leg. No break, just a deep sprain. She applied a cooling gel from her pack and whispered a reassurance. The foal accepted her touch, ears flicking but unafraid. Midnight stood over her, eyes shining, not with fear or dominance, but with a strange mutual understanding. Night descended fully, the meadow bathed in silver moonlight. Elena sat with the herd, not as a ranger, not as a savior, but as a listener. One animal among many, all bound by the simple fact of presence. The world outside, the media, the skeptics, the noise, meant nothing here. What mattered was the quiet. The trust earned, the mercy given, the patience to let life unfold on its own terms. As the Mustangs melted back into the night, Elena lingered, her heart full of something deeper than gratitude, a humility that would never quite leave her again. She knew now that the wild had its own language, and that listening was the truest way to belong. She gathered her pack, scribbled one last note in her journal. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do is simply wait. Sometimes that's when the world reveals itself. And headed home under the stars, forever changed by what she had learned in the company of wild things. Autumn settled on Nevada with the subtlety of a fox. Cooler mornings, gold-edged afternoons, the sagebrush giving up its sweetness on every breeze. Elena Cruz's life, meanwhile, was anything but subtle. In the wake of her survival and her story, the world she thought she knew, the one of law, order, and straightforward truths, turned suddenly cold, prickly, and complicated. It started with phone calls and emails from people she'd never met, conservationists offering thanks, old ranchers telling stories, and city dwellers looking for hope. But there were other messages too, sharp, suspicious, and, at times, openly hostile. Land developers, lawyers, and even local officials bristled at the attention Elena's story had drawn. Profitable land deals were on the table, and any narrative that elevated the wild Mustangs, let alone made them out as heroes, was bad for business. It didn't take long before rumors started to swirl. On one radio talk show, a real estate lobbyist scoffed, "Next thing you know, we'll be saying coyotes run for office and jackrabbits pay taxes." Another called Elena unreliable, suggesting that she'd made up her ordeal to sabotage a land auction. She was called a myth maker, an emotional manipulator. And worse, the real pressure came from inside the system she dedicated her life to protecting. She was summoned to Carson City for a public hearing, an official review of her conduct and her testimony about the events in Bighorn Canyon. Elena understood the subtext. This was about more than her story. This was about power, money, and the right to decide what the wild was worth. She packed her best suit, the one she wore to funerals and weddings, and drove alone to the Capitol. The hearing chamber was a long room, paneled in pale wood, with government seals staring down from above. Elena took her seat at a small table, a pitcher of water, and a stack of documents in front of her. The rows behind her filled with an odd mix of faces, some curious, some cold, some quietly supportive. The panel of officials sat at the head of the room, shuffling papers, frowning over glasses, their nameplates reflecting the soft fluorescent light. The lead counsel, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for toughness, started the questioning. "Ranger Cruz, let's be clear. Are you testifying under oath that wild horses not only found you, but shielded you from harm and led a rescue party to your location?" Elena nodded. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady. "I am. I know how it sounds, but that's what happened." A rustle of skepticism passed through the room. The lawyer pressed on. Isn't it possible that you were delirious from heat stroke? Or that you misinterpreted the actions of animals driven by instinct, not intent? Elena leaned forward. I spent my career in these lands. I know the difference between wild curiosity and what I saw. They could have scattered. They didn't. They chose to stay. One even risked himself to lead help back to me. Another official, a developer's ally, spoke up. This all sounds very convenient, especially when your account is being used to justify blocking certain commercial projects in the area. A murmur from the gallery. Elena straightened her shoulders, remembering Midnight's steady gaze, the weight of wild trust. She let silence stretch, a lesson learned from her time with the herd. Finally, she spoke. I never claimed they were magical. I just stopped trying to control them, and that's when they showed me who they really are. Her words hung in the air, raw and simple. The panel fell quiet, unsure how to respond to truth that didn't fit into an agenda or a spreadsheet. But outside the chamber, Elena's words sparked something. A junior reporter live tweeted her testimony. By midnight, her phrase, I stopped trying to control them, and that's when they showed me who they really are, was trending online. Ordinary people reposted it. Parents wrote it on whiteboards for their children, and a popular musician turned it into a song that racked up hundreds of thousands of streams overnight. Public support surged. Petitions to protect Nevada's wild herds gathered thousands of signatures in days. A group of veterans sent Elena a letter, saying her courage reminded them of their own moments in the wild, when animals had appeared just when hope seemed lost. At-risk youth from a group home painted a mural of Midnight, rearing in the sunrise, with Elena's quote in bright, defiant letters across the sky. But inside the system, resistance only hardened. A county commissioner, red-faced with frustration, called a press conference to dismiss the myth-making and reiterate the economic benefits of the land deals. Let's not let fairy tales get in the way of progress, he barked, waving a sheaf of charts. Another official pushed to have Elena reassigned to an urban district, far from the wilds she loved. Anonymous threats appeared in her mailbox, clipped headlines, photographs, a drawing of a wild horse pinned in red ink. Through it all, Elena held her ground. She refused to embellish or backtrack. I won't make it bigger or smaller than it was, she told a friend. The truth is enough. Still, the pressure mounted. Her sleep grew fitful. She worried about retaliation, about her career, about the fate of the Mustangs and the land they ran on. Sometimes she drove out to the edge of Bighorn Canyon, parking in the hush of the dusk, hoping for a glimpse of Midnight's herd. Sometimes they appeared, sometimes not. But always, Elena felt their presence, the way the wild does, never loud, never desperate, just persistent. One cold morning, as frost rimmed the sage and the sky turned pearl, Elena woke to find a note slipped under her door. It was unsigned, typed in block letters. Thank you for not giving up. The wild still matters. She pressed the paper to her heart, tears stinging her eyes. In that quiet moment, Elena understood something her adversaries never would. The wild didn't need her to be its champion. It only needed her not to look away, not to let the world forget that wonder existed, whether people chose to believe in it or not. Later that week, at a town hall, a teenage girl stood up and asked Elena, "How do you keep going when nobody believes you?" Elena smiled, her voice gentle but firm. Because I remember how it felt to be seen, not by people, but by something bigger. Because the wild taught me that being present, even in doubt, is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. The room fell silent, not out of disbelief, but awe. Something true had been spoken, and even those who didn't want to hear it felt its weight. And out there, where the land turned wild and the night wind carried secrets, the Mustangs ran on, untamed, unbroken, indifferent to human politics. Only presence, only patience, only the courage to bear witness. Elena understood now. That was the code of the wild. And for the first time, she knew she was not alone in living it. Winter in Nevada was a study in contrasts, frost lacing the sagebrush at dawn, then sunlight warming the hills until the earth shimmered, as if the desert itself couldn't decide whether to sleep or wake. For Elena Cruz, the changing season brought a restless energy. The hearing was behind her, but the world outside was shifting in ways she could barely keep up with. What began as one woman's survival story had ignited something much bigger. Across the region, and then the country, a movement was gaining momentum. People wanted to know the Mustangs, to protect them, to be changed by them. Donations began to pour in, small bills folded into envelopes, checks from strangers in distant states, even a letter from a school in Chicago enclosing 22 crayon drawings of Midnight, each one a little wild and wonderful. Conservation groups pledged support. Local businesses, some of whom had doubted Elena's story at first, quietly offered land or supplies. And when the state legislature met that spring, they approved a grant for something nobody had dared propose before: a permanent sanctuary for wild horses dedicated not just to rescue, but to education, healing, and hope. Elena, humbled and overwhelmed, sat with James Park on the porch of an old ranch house overlooking what would soon be called Midnight Ridge. "I keep waiting for someone to take it all back," she confessed, staring out at the snowy peaks in the distance. "Like it's just a dream and I'll wake up in the desert again." James laughed, handing her a mug of strong coffee. "Dreams don't raise $500,000 in a month, Cruz. And they don't fill this porch with letters from kids, veterans, and old-timers who all say the same thing." You reminded them of what's real. Midnight Ridge opened quietly on the first warm day of April, with only a handful of guests and no fanfare. It was a place unlike any other. No cages, no gimmicks, just rolling hills, quiet trails, and the space for both horses and humans to breathe. The first Mustangs arrived in battered trailers, their manes tangled, eyes wary. Many had been seized from illegal roundups or rescued from neglect. Others were brought by families who could no longer care for them, their children weeping and then smiling as the horses galloped free for the first time. Elena and her team, James, a handful of volunteers, and 2 veterans from the local VA, set about building trust. They moved slowly, with patience and respect, letting the horses come to them on their own terms. It was hard, messy work, sometimes heartbreaking. Horses who had known nothing but fear took weeks to allow a gentle touch. Some never did, and that, Elena realized, was part of the lesson. Healing wasn't always about taming. Sometimes it was about simply letting others be as wild as they needed to be. Word spread. People began to visit, not just for the horses, but for themselves. At-risk youth came with social workers, unsure and silent at first. Over time, they learned to muck stalls, brush out tangled tails, and stand still in the early morning waiting for the Mustangs to appear out of the mist. Veterans, some haunted by memories they couldn't share, found quiet comfort walking the ridge trails, their footsteps in sync with the herd's distant thunder. No one expected miracles, but little by little, something changed in those who spent time at Midnight Ridge. One girl who had refused to speak for months whispered to a chestnut mare and broke into laughter when the horse snorted back. A man who'd survived a war stood beside Midnight, himself. Yes, the Midnight, who had come down from the hills on his own terms, never captured, but always watching, and, after hours of silent company, went home and slept through the night for the first time in years. Midnight's presence was legendary, almost mythic. He never stayed long, just long enough to be seen, a silent sentinel standing on the highest hill as the sun set. Sometimes, on the quietest evenings, Elena would spot him at the edge of the property, silhouetted against the sky, mane streaming in the wind, his silver scar catching the last light. Children waited for these moments, pointing and gasping, calling him the King of the Ridge. Adults, too, fell silent, sensing something sacred in his watchfulness. Elena never tried to coax him closer. She knew, instinctively, that respect was the only currency the wild accepted. He was not a pet, not a mascot, not even a symbol. He was a reminder. Freedom was not about running from the world, but about choosing where and how to stand within it. As the months passed, Midnight Ridge grew into a sanctuary for stories as much as for animals. Survivors of trauma, young and old, shared their pain around evening campfires, drawing strength from the knowledge that healing could be slow, that some wounds were meant to remain visible. Elena led workshops in listening and patient observation, skills the horses had taught her, far beyond what any human curriculum could offer. State officials, once so eager to dismiss her, now praised her work at press conferences and in interviews. More land was added to the sanctuary, bought with donations and granted by a rare alignment of politics and goodwill. Scientists visited to study the Mustangs' behaviors and their findings of cooperation, communication, even acts of compassion among the herd made headlines of their own. But the heart of Midnight Ridge remained unchanged, a quiet place where people and horses learned to trust, to be vulnerable, and to honor the wildness in each other. No one was ever forced to touch a horse, or even to speak. Sometimes, healing happened in the hush, standing at a fence, watching a black stallion graze in the distance, feeling the old pain ease just a little with every breath. On the anniversary of Elena's rescue, a group of children gathered at dusk on the hilltop. They carried lanterns and hopes, songs, and secrets. Midnight watched from afar as Elena spoke, her words simple, honest, full of gratitude. She thanked the wild, the community, and most of all, the horses for reminding everyone that sometimes, to save each other, all you have to do is stay. And as darkness swept across the ridge, the Mustangs lifted their heads, snorted into the cool air, and galloped into the night, untamed, unbroken, forever free. Spring arrived in waves, the valley around Midnight Ridge shimmering with new grass and the wildflowers that only bloomed when the rain got just bold enough. The sanctuary had become a quiet phenomenon. Visitors arrived from all corners of the country, some drawn by the legend, others by a need for healing they didn't yet know how to name. Elena Cruz found herself busier than ever, yet more peaceful too. Something had shifted inside her since that terrible, miraculous ordeal, a quiet steadiness, as if the wild had rooted itself in her bones. One warm morning, Elena was invited onto a national podcast, Voices of the American Wild, to tell her story in full. She hesitated at first. After everything, she was wary of cameras, wary of microphones that could turn something real into something marketable. But the host, a thoughtful journalist named Mia Nguyen, promised her space and promised not to rush. In a sunlit room overlooking the pastures, Elena sat down with Mia, her hands steady around a mug of tea. The recording light blinked red. Mia's questions were gentle at first, details about the rescue, about Midnight, about the birth of the sanctuary. But soon she leaned in, voice soft. What do you think really happened out there? Why do you think those wild horses helped you? Elena took a long breath, remembering the heat, the silence, the sound of hoofbeats at the edge of her life. They didn't save me because they knew me. They saved me because I wasn't trying to own them. She paused, letting the words settle. I was just there, helpless, alone, not asking for anything, not threatening. Maybe I finally learned to see them for what they were, not as something to control, but as lives moving through the same wild world as mine. Mia nodded, silent, letting the recording stretch out. Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. I think we've mistaken silence for ignorance, but sometimes silence is wisdom. We think the wild is empty just because it's quiet, just because we don't hear what we want. But when I stopped talking, when I let go of what I thought I knew, I started to see what was right in front of me. The horses weren't wild, in the way people mean. They were themselves. And in their presence, I realized I didn't need to be in charge. I needed to be present. The episode aired that week and exploded across the internet. Listeners responded with a flood of messages, stories about being helped by animals, about times when they felt the world was watching out for them in small, unexplainable ways. Teachers played the podcast for students. Therapists used clips in sessions. A prisoner in Arizona wrote a letter to the sanctuary. For the first time in years, I felt hope just hearing about a place where presence is enough. Requests for Elena's voice multiplied. She gave speeches at conservation conferences and Zoom calls with classrooms. She always began with the same words. You don't have to believe in miracles. You just have to believe that being present matters. At one school assembly, a young boy asked her if she thought midnight was magic. Elena smiled, shaking her head. He's not magic. He's free. And freedom, if you watch closely, looks a lot like magic to those who've forgotten what it means. Elena realized, as months passed, that the real legacy of her experience was not just the sanctuary, or even the story, but the challenge it set before anyone willing to listen. To see without judgment, to notice without owning, to let silence teach. She remembered her own lessons from the horses, especially from Midnight, who still appeared on the ridge now and then, never letting anyone get too close, but always watching. He'd never let her thank him or try to repay. His gift had been presence, nothing more. One evening, Elena sat by the pasture fence, notebook in her lap. As the sunset painted the world gold and crimson, a group of mustangs grazed in the distance, foals darting between mares, tails flicking. Midnight stood on the ridge, a shadow against the sky. Elena watched, breath held, as he turned his head and seemed to meet her gaze for a moment, a reminder of everything unsaid, everything understood. A woman visiting from Chicago took a seat beside Elena. She'd come to the sanctuary for rest after her sister's death, hoping for a sign, a sense of peace. "I keep waiting for a miracle," the woman admitted quietly. Elena thought of the desert, of silence, of listening, of the wildness that asked only to be seen. "Sometimes a miracle isn't a lightning bolt," she said, voice gentle. "Sometimes it's just being noticed by something that owes you nothing. Sometimes it's learning to see what's always been there, waiting." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. The horses grazed, the earth spun, the world went on. That summer, Elena gave one more talk, a TED-style presentation, broadcast from the sanctuary's barn with sunlight and swallows for an audience. She stood in her boots and jeans, hands bare, face open. "The wild didn't choose me because I was special. The wild saved me because I learned to let go of what I thought I knew. I let go of needing answers. I just listened. And in that silence, I found everything I'd been missing." She closed the talk with a challenge. "I invite you, all of you listening, to spend a day in silence. Go outside. Find a place where nothing needs you, where you are not the center. Wait and listen and watch. You'll be amazed what you see." Her words echoed far beyond the Nevada hills. People posted their stories and photos of rivers, hawks, quiet woods, and city parks at dawn. More and more, Elena realized, the real work was not in saving the wild, but in letting the wild save us, one open moment at a time. And on the ridge, under a vault of endless sky, Midnight stood sentinel, not as a savior or a symbol, but as himself, as free and untamed as the silence that had taught Elena everything she needed to know. A year had passed since that impossible night in the desert, and Elena Cruz's life looked nothing like it did before. The world outside Midnight Ridge still spun with its noisy demands, emails to answer, budgets to balance, news cycles to survive. But within the fences of the sanctuary, time moved differently. Here, the wind shaped the days, and the horses, untamed, mysterious, set the true rhythm. Elena awoke every morning with the sun, slipping from her bunk in the old ranch house, drawn by the quiet promise of dawn. She found herself craving silence now, the kind that hummed with meaning, the gentle snort of a foal, the steady breath of the land, the distant thunder of hooves when the herd moved through the hills. In that silence, she felt closer to herself, and closer to the truth that had revealed itself when she was most vulnerable. It was time, she realized, to share that truth as fully and honestly as she could, not for fame or attention, but because the lesson she'd learned belonged to everyone. Invitations to speak at universities and conferences had piled up, but Elena chose to deliver her story in her own way. One breezy April afternoon, she stood at the heart of the sanctuary's gathering barn, the doors flung wide to let in the smells of earth and horses. Her audience was a blend of local kids, veterans, teachers, a documentary crew, and, sitting in the very back row, her mother, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The event was streamed live, the world peering in through thousands of screens. Elena felt the familiar nerves, but she let them pass through her like the wind. She began with gratitude. Thank you for listening, for coming, for believing, whether in the story, in the wild, or just in the possibility that something outside ourselves is worth our attention. She paused, scanning the faces before her, some open, some skeptical, all waiting. Elena told the story again, her own way. She didn't embellish or romanticize the pain, the terror, or the moments when hope seemed gone. She described the agony of thirst, the feel of rough rope burning her skin, the pure animal panic. But then, she spoke of the horses, their patience, their decision not to run, the way they shielded her, offered their silence as a gift. They owed me nothing, she said quietly. But they gave me everything by simply staying. They didn't need a reason. They just chose to be present. She talked about the world's reaction, the disbelief, the skepticism, the support, the criticism. I was called a liar, a myth-maker, even an obstacle to progress. But I never claimed the horses were magical. What I learned was this: compassion doesn't require a common language. You don't protect someone because they belong to you. You protect them because you choose to. Her voice wavered for a moment. She looked out through the barn doors, searching the distant ridge, hoping for a glimpse of midnight. The sun caught on a moving shadow. Was that him? Watching as always from a safe distance? She smiled. The wild isn't lawless, Elena continued. It follows a code we never learned, a code of respect, of listening, of presence. In the wild, there's no ownership. There's just the daily, deliberate choice to be there for one another, or to walk away. She paused, letting her words settle. The silence was thick and deep, the kind that invites truth. People ask me, why do you think the Mustangs helped you? The honest answer is, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't help in the way we mean it. Maybe it was just mercy. The mercy of sharing space with another living thing. Maybe that's all we need sometimes. Not rescue, not answers. Just mercy, just presence. Elena invited questions. A child asked if she was ever afraid of being alone now. Elena knelt down and smiled. Not anymore. Because I know the wild is never empty. Even when it's silent, it's full of life, of potential, of kindness, waiting for us to notice. A veteran stood, voice cracking with emotion. What do we owe the wild after everything you've been through? Elena replied, we owe it our respect, our patience, our willingness to listen before we act. If a horse can choose to save a human, why do so many humans choose to look away? The documentary crew zoomed in as Elena offered her final reflection, not rehearsed but honest, the core truth burning in her heart. We spend so much time trying to own, to fix, to dominate the world around us. We forget that sometimes the greatest gift we can give or receive is presence. Not fixing, not judging, just being there. The wild horses didn't make me a promise or demand gratitude. They simply existed beside me, and in that moment that was the greatest mercy I could have received. She looked again to the ridge. The sun was sinking. Midnight's herd, black shapes against gold light, watched in perfect stillness. Elena closed her eyes, and for a moment she felt the peace of that silent understanding. The gift of belonging, not through power or words, but through choice. As applause echoed through the barn and across the live stream, Elena stepped away from the microphone, letting the story be what it would. She watched as people drifted out, quieter and more thoughtful, some pausing to touch the fence or gaze into the wide blue sky. The children laughed and chased each other in the grass, their voices high and wild, as if the spirit of the Mustangs had found a new way to run free. That evening, as darkness settled, Elena sat alone beneath the stars. She didn't wish for answers anymore. She wished for courage, for herself, and for everyone listening to choose presence over power, listening over certainty, mercy over judgment. And on the far side of Midnight Ridge, under a rising moon, the wild herd lifted their heads to the night, unbroken, unowned, and forever free. A living lesson for anyone brave enough to see it. The lesson was simple and true. Compassion isn't about ownership, but about choice. Mercy is presence. And sometimes, the wildest thing of all is to stay.